Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a cold and foggy night when a young couple, Daniel and Emily, found themselves driving down a desolate stretch of highway, hoping to reach their destination before the storm hit. But just as they were about to give up and pull over for the night, they saw the flickering neon sign of a small motel up ahead. The place seemed deserted, but they were desperate. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wind howled as they made their way into the motel parking lot. The motel itself looked ancient, a relic from another era, with peeling paint on the wooden sign and a narrow driveway leading to a series of small rooms. The front office was dark, but a light flickered inside. Daniel knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a strange man appeared in the doorway. He looked worn, his face covered in shadow, but his eyes gleamed unnervingly bright in the dim light. "Just one room?" Daniel asked. The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving them. "2 beds," Emily added, trying to ignore the growing unease in her stomach. The man handed them a key, his fingers cold as they brushed against Daniel's palm. "Room 5, he rasped, his voice low and hushed. "Stay as long as you need, but don't go out at night." His words, simple yet chilling, echoed in their minds as they walked away. They settled into the room, and for a moment, it seemed as though it would be just another dull night in a rundown motel. But as soon as they tried to sleep, things began to feel off. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows. Then, just as Daniel was about to drift off, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the door caught his attention. At first, he thought it was the sound of the storm, but when it continued, it grew more distinct. Someone walking up and down the hallway, pausing outside their door, then walking away again. Emily, clearly unsettled, whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Probably just the storm," Daniel murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. But the footsteps didn't stop. It was as though the person was waiting for something, waiting for them to open the door. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Daniel leapt out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the door and swung it open, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the only sound the steady drip of water from the storm outside. He stepped into the hallway, looking both ways, but there was no sign of anyone. "Daniel, please, let's just leave," Emily pleaded from the room, her voice shaking. Reluctantly, he closed the door, but as he turned to lock it, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. The person was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, a tall, gaunt man who seemed out of place in the dimly lit corridor. His face was obscured by shadows, but Daniel could feel his eyes on him, piercing through the darkness. Daniel backed away slowly, not daring to take his eyes off the figure. He turned to Emily, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "We need to go, now." The two grabbed their things in a panic, but when they reached the front office to check out, the man was nowhere to be found. The office was dark, the door slightly ajar. They stepped inside cautiously, but the room was empty, no sign of the strange man who had given them the key. The register was open on the desk, and as Daniel's eyes skimmed the names on the page, his heart stopped. There, scrawled at the bottom, was their own name, Daniel and Emily, room 5. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was as though the man had been expecting them. When they turned to leave, they noticed something chilling etched into the wall beside the front door. "Don't stay past midnight." They never looked back as they fled the motel, driving off into the night, their hearts still racing. But as they drove away, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing by the motel window, watching them leave. And in that instant, she saw his eyes, glowing faintly, red as embers. The motel, however, remained in the distance, lost in the fog. It seemed to disappear as if it had never been there at all. Some say it's still there, hidden in the mist, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to stumble upon its eerie grasp.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Lily and her friends had rented a house in the mountains, far from the noise and chaos of the city. They were looking forward to a weekend of relaxation and fun, nestled in the isolation of a remote cabin. But the moment they arrived, something felt off. The house, a large, dark structure, stood alone among the trees, its windows almost too wide, too empty. The air was thick with silence, as if the forest surrounding it had forgotten how to breathe. At first, they chalked it up to the isolation, the kind of peace you only find when you're miles from civilization. They unpacked their bags and started a fire in the old stone fireplace, ignoring the strange feeling creeping along their spines. The first night passed uneventfully. But on the second evening, Lily started noticing things. Little things, like doors creaking open when no one was near them, or the faintest of whispers coming from the corners of the house. At first, she convinced herself it was the wind or the house settling, but the strange occurrences grew harder to ignore. The whispers began to form words, and the footsteps, soft, deliberate, like someone was pacing just beyond her line of sight, were harder to explain away. One evening, as they were sitting around the fire, Lily heard a loud bang coming from upstairs. Her friends didn't seem to hear it, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. But Lily couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut that something was in the house with them. She excused herself and went upstairs, heart racing, each step creaking beneath her feet. As she approached the room at the end of the hallway, the door was ajar. She pushed it open cautiously. The room was empty, but on the floor she saw a scattering of old photographs, their edges yellowed with time. She bent down to examine them, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the faces. It was her and her friends, but they were taken years ago. How could they be in these photographs? The memories were from her childhood, but she had never been to this house before. Shaken, Lily gathered the photos and headed back downstairs, but as she reached the landing, she froze. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, just out of reach of the flickering light. It was a man, tall, thin, with a long, dark coat that hung loosely around him. His face was obscured by shadow, but Lily felt his eyes on her, cold and piercing. He didn't speak, he didn't move. But when Lily turned to scream for her friends, they were all standing in the doorway, watching her with expressions that seemed wrong. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, unblinking, as if they were trapped in some strange trance. And behind them, in the doorway to the living room, the man stood, his presence now filling the entire space. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she ran toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that rattled her bones. Panic surged through her veins as the house seemed to close in around her. She turned to see the figure now standing directly behind her friends, his long fingers almost touching their shoulders. She screamed again, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then, as if on cue, her friends all turned to face her in unison, their eyes hollow and empty. It was as if they were no longer the people she knew. They were empty shells, hollowed out by something dark, something inhuman. Lily backed away, her mind racing. She needed to get out, but the house seemed to be shifting, warping around her. The windows were now covered in thick layers of grime, the walls closing in. And the figure, he was moving closer, his long fingers now brushing the backs of her friends' necks. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized the truth. This wasn't just a house, it was a prison, and it had been waiting for her all along. She wasn't meant to leave. None of them were. With one final, desperate effort, Lily rushed toward the door, but as her hand touched the handle, she felt it, an icy grip on her wrist. She turned to find the man standing directly behind her, his face now fully illuminated. His eyes were black, hollow pits, and his lips curled into a grotesque, empty smile. The last thing Lily heard was her friends' voices, now just whispers, calling her name from the other side of the door. But she never opened it. The man's grip tightened and everything went black. When the authorities finally arrived, months later, all they found was the house, abandoned, rotting, as though it had been empty for years. There were no signs of Lily or any of her friends, just the same photographs scattered across the floor, their edges now frayed, their faces staring back at the empty rooms. Some say the house still stands in the mountains, its doors and windows waiting for the next travelers to come, waiting for the next souls to be trapped forever within its walls. Others say that sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers calling you in the wind.
Story number 3.
A group of college students, eager for a break from their intense final exams, decided to take a trip to a cabin in the woods. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat. away from the pressures of school and technology where they could bond over games, stories, and laughter. They had rented the cabin online, drawn to the rustic charm and the seclusion it promised. However, the moment they arrived, there was an unsettling feeling in the air. The cabin was older than the pictures had shown. The wood was weathered and gray, the windows cracked and dirty, and the front porch creaked under the weight of the wind. But they shrugged it off, too excited to let anything spoil their plans. After unpacking, they sat around the fireplace, playing games and sharing stories until the conversation drifted toward ghost stories. It was a tradition at every gathering. Who could tell the scariest tale? One of the students, Ryan, suggested they tell stories about the cabin itself. It didn't take long for someone to mention the legends surrounding it. Rumors that it had once belonged to a hermit, a man who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind strange markings on the walls and a collection of cryptic books. Some locals whispered that the man had made a deal with something darker than any human could understand. Others said his spirit still roamed the woods, trapped in the cabin. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. The students laughed uneasily, brushing off their nervousness, and decided to take a walk around the property. As they ventured into the woods, they found strange symbols carved into the trees, some faded, others fresh. Their initial amusement began to fade, replaced by an unsettling chill. They quickly turned back, eager to return to the safety of the cabin. But when they arrived, they noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was wide open, though they were sure they had closed it behind them. They hesitated, but eventually, one of them stepped inside. The air was colder now, and the fire in the hearth had almost completely died down. It was as though something had been waiting for them, watching them. As the group gathered around the dying fire, strange sounds began to echo through the house, footsteps in the hallway, the faint sound of whispers. It started with one, then another. Soon, all of them could hear it, voices, distant but growing closer, as if something or someone was moving through the house just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" one of the students asked, her voice trembling. The others nodded, the tension thick in the room. They were not alone. As the whispers grew louder, they began to form words, scratching against the walls, echoing through the floors. "Leave. Now. Leave." The voice sounded almost like it was coming from the very wood of the house itself. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with such force that it shook the entire cabin. The students froze. The air grew dense, suffocating. Then, just as quickly, the temperature dropped, their breath visible in the icy air. The fire in the hearth was now nothing but a faint glow, barely enough to illuminate the room. Ryan, trying to rationalize the events, reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door was sealed shut by an invisible force. Panic began to rise in their chests as the whispers grew louder, now all around them, swirling and chanting in an unintelligible language. They backed away from the door, their eyes wide with fear. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe, as though something was moving within them. And then, through the gloom, a figure appeared. Tall and indistinct, its features blurred and shifting. Its presence was suffocating, a darkness that seemed to consume everything in its path. The students screamed, trying to scramble toward the windows, but they were covered in layers of dirt and grime, impossible to see through. The figure stepped closer, its silhouette now clear. It was a man, or something that had once been a man, with hollow eyes that reflected nothing but pure emptiness. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight across his bones, his mouth twisted into a grin that sent chills down their spines. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure rasped, its voice like dry leaves in the wind. "You never should have come." The students rushed to the back door, but it too was locked tight. They tried to break windows, but their hands trembled too violently, and the glass seemed to resist their touch. As the figure grew closer, they could hear its breathing, a slow, deliberate exhale, like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. In a desperate panic, they grabbed their phones to call for help, but there was no signal. The outside world had vanished. They were trapped. The growl grew louder, closer, and the dark figure loomed just beyond their reach, its eyes never leaving them. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, the cabin was silent. There was no sign of the students, no trace of them ever having been there. The only thing that remained was the faint smell of burning wood, as though a fire had been raging in the hearth the night before. Locals passing by the cabin weeks later reported seeing strange symbols etched into the doorframe, the same symbols that had been carved into the trees. The whispers were gone, but the lingering sense of something ancient, something malevolent, still clung to the place. No one dared to go near the cabin again, and the legend of the vanished students became just another story, a warning for anyone foolish enough to visit the cabin in the woods. And as for the students, some say they're still there, lost between worlds, trapped in the house by something darker than they could ever comprehend. Their whispers, faint and distant, can still be heard, carried by the wind through the trees.